The clinic was dead silent when a rugged, blood-soaked stranger burst through the doors carrying his dying dog. But as the exhausted Navy SEAL collapsed beside the animal's cage, the night shift nurse noticed something impossible. The dog's weathered collar wasn't just familiar. It was a ghost from her past. The rain was coming down in sheets over San Diego, hammering the roof of the Pacific Coast 24-hour Veterinary Emergency Center. At 3:15 in the morning, the waiting room was a hollow chamber of fluorescent lights and empty plastic chairs. Charlotte Winters, the lead trauma nurse on the graveyard shift, was wiping down the triage counter, her mind numb from the rhythmic drone of the HVAC unit. It had been a mercifully quiet night. Then, the automatic doors shattered the silence, sliding open with a violent mechanical hiss. A man sprinted into the lobby, his heavy combat boots squealing on the wet linoleum. He was drenched, his faded olive-drab tactical pants plastered to his legs, a plain black t-shirt clinging to a heavily muscled frame. But it was the bundle in his arms that sent Charlotte's heart into her throat. Wrapped in a blood-soaked denim jacket was a massive Belgian Malinois. The animal's head hung limply over the man's thick forearm, its tongue lolling sideways, eyes rolled back into its skull. "Help me!" the man roared, his voice cracking with a terrifying mixture of authority and sheer, unadulterated panic. "Somebody, please God, help him." Charlotte didn't hesitate. "Code red, Trauma Room 1, she shouted over her shoulder, slamming her palm against the emergency buzzer before vaulting over the low swinging door of the reception desk. Dr. Roland Pierce came skidding out of the break room, a stethoscope already in his hand, his eyes wide. "Put him on the gurney, right now," Charlotte commanded, her professional instincts kicking into overdrive as she wheeled a stainless steel transport cart toward the stranger. The man gently lowered the massive dog onto the metal surface. As he pulled the denim jacket away, Charlotte sucked in a sharp breath. The dog's abdomen was severely distended, and a jagged, gaping laceration tore across its right flank, oozing dark venous blood. The animal's breathing was shallow and rapid, a terrifying rattle that echoed in the quiet room. "Hit and run," the man gasped, his hands trembling violently as they hovered over the dog's head, afraid to touch him, afraid to let him go. A truck ran a red light, clipped him, and kept going. "He's losing too much blood. Please, you can't let him die." "We need him in the back, sir. You have to stay here," Charlotte said, grabbing the rails of the gurney. "No, I'm coming with him," the man growled, stepping forward, his broad shoulders squaring. Under the harsh lights, Charlotte saw the faded ink of a Navy SEAL trident tattooed on his inner forearm. The scarred knuckles, the haunted, frantic eyes of a man who had seen the worst of the world, now completely undone by the broken animal in front of him. "Sir," Charlotte said, her voice dropping to a calm, steady timbre. She met his panicked gaze directly. "If you come back there, you will be in my way. If you are in my way, he dies. Let us do our jobs." The harsh truth landed like a physical blow. The SEAL's jaw clenched tight enough to crack bone, but he stepped back, raising his blood-stained hands in surrender. "Save him," he whispered, his voice shattering. Charlotte and Dr. Pierce pushed through the double doors into the trauma suite. The next 2 hours were a chaotic blur of blood, sterile gauze, and the high-pitched, frantic beeping of heart monitors. The Malinois had internal hemorrhaging from a ruptured spleen and 3 cracked ribs. "Pushing 1 milligram of epinephrine," Charlotte called out, her hands moving with practiced precision as she injected the medication into the IV line. The dog's heart rate was crashing, dipping into dangerously low territory. "Clamp," Dr. Pierce demanded, his hands buried deep in the dog's abdominal cavity. "He's fading, Charlotte. The spleen is completely pulverized." "Come on, buddy. Stay with us," Charlotte muttered, watching the monitor as she adjusted the oxygen flow. She wiped a line of sweat from her own forehead. She had seen countless dogs on this table, but there was a fierce, undeniable gravity to this one. The animal had a scarred muzzle and missing tips on its ears. A working dog, a fighter. Don't you quit on him. He needs you. Slowly, agonizingly, the monitor's frantic alarm gave way to a steady, rhythmic beep. Dr. Pierce successfully clamped the bleeder and removed the remnants of the ruptured spleen. They spent another hour stitching the torn muscle and skin along the flank. By the time they finally turned off the overhead surgical lights, the sun was just beginning to turn the San Diego sky a bruised, stormy purple. Charlotte stripped off her bloodied surgical gown and gloves, her muscles aching with exhaustion. The dog, whose intake chart she had hastily labeled John Doe Malinois, was stable, but heavily sedated and critical. She walked back out to the waiting room. The stranger was sitting on the floor in the corner, his back pressed against the wall, his knees drawn up to his chest. He was staring blankly at a spot on the tiles. The blood on his hands now dried into a dark, rusty crust. "Sir?" Charlotte said softly. His head snapped up, his eyes wide and terrified. "Is he?" "He's alive," Charlotte said, offering a tired, reassuring smile. "It was extremely close. He lost his spleen, and he has a few broken ribs, but he made it through the surgery. He's strong." The massive, hardened military man closed his eyes, and a solitary tear carved a path down his dust and sweat-streaked face. He let out a breath that sounded like a collapsing lung. "Can I see him?" "He's in the intensive care ward. He won't wake up for a while, but yes, you can sit with him." The ICU ward was a dimly lit, temperature-controlled room lined with heavy-duty stainless steel enclosures. The only sounds were the whirring of oxygen concentrators and the rhythmic dripping of IV fluids. Charlotte led the man, whose name she now knew from the intake forms was Weston Ryder, into the ward. The Malinois was lying on a thick pile of heated blankets in the largest lower cage, an oxygen mask loosely strapped over his scarred snout. Charlotte pulled up a rolling stool for Weston, but he ignored it. Instead, he dropped heavily to the cold linoleum floor, right beside the steel grating of the door. He pressed his face against the cold metal bars, sliding his large, calloused fingers through the gaps to gently stroke the soft fur behind the dog's ears. "I'm here, buddy," Weston whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I got you. You're going to be okay." Charlotte watched them from the doorway for a long moment. There was a profound, unspoken language between a military handler and his working dog. She knew it intimately. Her older brother, Corbin, had been a Navy SEAL dog handler. Growing up, Corbin's letters home were less about his own safety and more about his canine partner, a ferocious but fiercely loyal Malinois named Diesel. When Corbin's convoy was hit by an IED in Helmand Province 3 years ago, the military had informed the family that both Corbin and Diesel had perished in the blast. The loss had hollowed Charlotte out, driving her to pour her grief into saving every animal she could. Seeing Weston on the floor, keeping a silent, desperate vigil over his dog, brought a fresh ache to Charlotte's chest. She quietly stepped out of the ward to give him privacy, returning to the triage desk to process the surgical notes. An hour later, the sun was fully up. Charlotte prepared a fresh bag of saline and a dose of pain medication, carrying them quietly back into the ICU. Weston had fallen asleep. Exhaustion had finally claimed him. He was lying on his side on the hard floor, his arms still extended through the bars, his hand resting protectively over the dog's massive paws. Charlotte smiled softly, stepping carefully over his outstretched legs to reach the IV pole. As she swapped out the fluid bags, her hip brushed against a small stainless steel prep table adjacent to the cage. On it sat the belongings that had been removed from the dog prior to surgery: the blood-stained denim jacket, a heavy-duty tactical leash, and the dog's collar. Charlotte reached out to move the collar aside, to make room for her clipboard. As her fingers brushed the material, she froze. This wasn't a standard-issue military nylon collar, nor was it something bought at a pet store. It was heavily customized. The base was a thick, olive-drab tactical webbing, but woven over it was an intricate, tight layer of 550 military paracord in a distinct king cobra pattern. The cord alternated between desert tan and a very specific, rare shade of maroon. Charlotte's breath hitched in her throat. The room seemed to tilt, the humming of the oxygen machine suddenly sounding like a roaring ocean in her ears. With trembling hands, she picked up the heavy collar, the maroon cord. She remembered scouring 3 different surplus stores in San Diego to find that exact color, because it was Corbin's high school football team's color. She had woven this exact collar. She remembered the blisters on her thumbs from pulling the tough nylon cord tight, She remembered sitting on the porch of their childhood home, laughing with Corbin as she presented it to him just days before his final, fatal deployment. "It's indestructible, Charlie," Corbin had said, grinning as he fastened it around Diesel's neck. "Just like us." Charlotte's heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "No, it's a coincidence. It has to be a coincidence. Millions of people weave paracord collars." Desperate for sanity, she flipped the heavy collar over in her hands. Corbin had always complained about the jingling noise standard dog tags made on stealth missions. So Charlotte had done something unique. She had taken a small, flat piece of brass, hand-stamped it, and used heavy-duty rivets to secure it flat against the inside of the collar, resting flush against the dog's neck. Her thumbs traced the inner webbing. She felt the hard, rectangular outline of the metal plate. A tear broke free, tracking hot down her cheek. She rotated the collar under the dim light of the ICU overhead bulb, rubbing her thumb over the tarnished brass plate to clear away the grime and dried blood. The uneven, hand-struck letters stared back at her. Diesel, Handler, C. Winters, USN, Team 3. A choked, strangled gasp escaped Charlotte's lips. She dropped her clipboard, the plastic clattering violently against the floor. Weston jerked awake instantly, his combat instincts snapping him from deep sleep to high alert in a fraction of a second. He sat up, his eyes darting around the room before locking onto Charlotte. She was standing frozen, her face pale as a sheet, trembling violently as she clutched the bloody collar to her chest. She stared down at the sleeping, scarred Malinois in the cage, then shifted her wild, tear-filled eyes to the rugged seal sitting on the floor. "Where did you get this dog?" Charlotte whispered, her voice cracking, barely audible over the machines. Weston frowned, clearly disoriented and defensive. "What? That's my dog. His name is Blaze." "Don't lie to me," Charlotte choked out, stepping closer, holding the collar out with a shaking hand, her finger pointing directly at the hidden brass plate. "His name is Diesel, and 3 years ago, the United States Navy told my family he was blown up in the Helmand province alongside my brother." Weston's entire body went rigid. The color drained from his weathered face. He looked from the collar up to Charlotte's tear-streaked eyes, and a profound, terrifying realization dawned on his features. "Charlie," Weston breathed out, the name catching in his throat. You're Corbin's little sister?" The clinical hum of the intensive care ward seemed to completely evaporate, leaving behind a suffocating, heavy silence. Charlotte stood absolutely paralyzed, her knuckles turning bone white as she gripped the bloodied paracord collar. Her mind was frantically trying to reject the reality standing in front of her. The United States Navy had delivered a folded flag to her family. They had presented a mahogany box, solemn handshakes, and a devastating narrative. Her brother Corbin, alongside his loyal canine partner Diesel, had been killed instantly in a catastrophic improvised explosive device detonation in the dusty, unforgiving deserts of Afghanistan. There were no remains of the dog to send home. That was the official story. That was the unshakable truth her family had mourned for 3 agonizing years. Yet here, sitting on the cold linoleum floor of a veterinary clinic in San Diego, was a rugged Navy SEAL who knew her nickname. And bleeding out in the cage beside him was a dog wearing a collar she had woven with her own 2 hands. "How do you know who I am?" Charlotte whispered, her voice fracturing into a desperate, trembling rasp. She took a step backward, her medical clogs squeaking against the pristine floor. "Who are you? And why do you have my dead brother's dog?" Weston Ryder slowly climbed to his feet, holding his hands up in a placating, non-threatening gesture. He looked completely shattered, the formidable, muscular operative suddenly appearing incredibly small under the harsh fluorescent lights. The walls he had built around his trauma were rapidly crumbling. "My name is Weston," he said, his voice thick and gravelly, laced with an ocean of unspoken grief. "I was your brother's spotter. I was in his squad, Charlie. Team 3. We were closer than blood. I was standing less than 15 feet away from him on the day the world ended." Charlotte's breath hitched violently. She reached out, gripping the stainless steel prep table to steady her shaking knees. "They told us Diesel died. They told us there was nothing left." Weston squeezed his eyes shut, and a single heavy tear escaped, tracking through the dried blood and dirt on his cheek. The military told you what they had to tell you. They told you the simplest version of a nightmare. But the truth is infinitely more complicated, and it's a burden I've been carrying for 3 long years. He leaned against the metal bars of the dog's cage, looking down at the heavily sedated, scarred Malinois breathing steadily through the oxygen mask. We were clearing a compound on the outskirts of Marja, Weston began, his voice dropping into a hollow, haunting cadence as he was pulled back into the memory. Intel said it was abandoned. It wasn't. It was a kill zone, a complex ambush. Before we even breached the main courtyard, the ground gave way. Corbin was on point. Diesel was out front, sweeping for explosives, but the IED was buried too deep, wrapped in thick plastic to mask the chemical signature. By the time Diesel caught the scent and locked up to signal us, it was too late. The triggerman was watching from a ridgeline. Charlotte choked back a sob, pressing her free hand over her mouth. She had tried so hard to avoid imagining the final moments of her brother's life. Now the grim reality was being painted in agonizing detail. Corbin knew, Weston continued, his voice breaking. He saw the shift in the dirt. He knew exactly what was about to happen, and in that split second, your brother didn't dive for cover. He didn't try to save himself, Charlie. He dove forward. He threw his entire body over Diesel, trying to shield the dog from the upward force of the blast, and he yelled at me to get back. Weston's chest heaved, his massive shoulders trembling as the phantom echoes of the explosion rang in his ears. The blast threw me backward through a crumbling mud wall. When the dust finally settled, the firefight was deafening. I crawled back through the rubble. Corbin was gone. He took the brunt of the shrapnel. He died a hero saving his partner. But beneath him, buried in the sand and his handler's blood, Diesel was still breathing. Charlotte let out a shattered weep, sinking slowly to the floor. Weston immediately knelt down opposite her, maintaining a respectful distance, but offering his profound, shared sorrow. The dog was completely broken, Weston whispered gently. Diesel had severe shrapnel wounds, permanent hearing loss in his left ear, and a catastrophic amount of psychological trauma. When we finally medevaced back to Bagram Airfield, the base veterinarians took him into emergency surgery. They patched him up, but he was fundamentally changed. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't let anyone touch him. He would just stare at the door, waiting for Corbin to walk through. Why didn't they send him home to us? Charlotte demanded, tears streaming down her face, her chest tight with righteous anger. He was Corbin's. He belonged with his family. Because he was classified as military equipment, Weston explained bitterly, his jaw clenching, and broken equipment gets discarded. The top brass evaluated him and determined he had severe PTSD. He was deemed too unstable for adoption, too aggressive to be reassigned to local law enforcement, and medically unfit to return to duty. The official paperwork was drawn up to have him humanely euthanized, to spare the family the bureaucratic agony, and because it was easier on the unit's morale, the commanding officer authorized the report stating the dog perished in the initial blast alongside his handler. They lied, she hissed, looking at the tarnished brass plate on the collar. They did, Weston agreed softly, but I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't let Corbin's ultimate sacrifice be in vain. I couldn't let the dog he gave his life to protect be put down in a cold kennel thousands of miles from home. So I did something incredibly illegal. I forged a commanding officer's signature, bribed a sympathetic flight mechanic on a C-17 transport plane, and smuggled the dog off the base. Charlotte stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. This hardened, imposing SEAL had risked a court-martial, his entire career, and a stint in Leavenworth military prison to save a broken animal. I renamed him Blaze, to avoid the manifests, Weston said, smiling sadly at the sleeping dog. When I got back stateside, I took him to a secluded cabin in Montana. I spent 2 years rehabilitating him. It took 6 months just to get him to sleep through the night without waking up screaming. We healed each other, Charlie. He was the only piece of Corbin I had left, but I always knew he wasn't truly mine. Weston reached into the pocket of his damp tactical pants and pulled out a battered, faded photograph. He slid it across the floor. Charlotte picked it up with trembling fingers. It was a picture of Corbin, grinning broadly in his desert camouflage, with a younger, unscarred Diesel sitting proudly at his side. On the back, in Corbin's familiar, messy scrawl, were the words, "If I don't make it, bring him to Charlie. She'll know what to do. He made me promise before that deployment," Weston said, wiping his eyes. "I brought him to San Diego a week ago. I've been sitting in a motel 2 miles from your house, trying to find the courage to knock on your door, to look Corbin's sister in the eye, and tell her I lived while her brother died. Tonight, I couldn't sleep. I took him for a walk to clear my head. We were crossing the intersection, and a drunk driver in a pickup truck blew the red light. I tried to pull him back, but the truck clipped him." Weston bowed his head, utterly defeated. "I promised Corbin I would protect him. I promised I would bring him back to you safe, and I failed." "No," Charlotte said fiercely, her voice suddenly finding a core of absolute, unyielding strength. She reached across the gap and placed her hand firmly over Weston's trembling, scarred knuckles. "You didn't fail. You brought him back to me. You saved his life in the desert. You healed his soul in the mountains. And you carried him here tonight. You kept your promise, Weston." The heavy atmosphere in the intensive care ward slowly began to lift as the morning light filtered through the frosted glass windows, casting a warm, golden glow across the sterile, stainless steel cages. The storm outside had finally broken, leaving behind a clear, vibrant San Diego sky. For the next 4 hours, Charlotte and Weston sat together on the floor of the clinic, sharing stories of the man they both loved and lost. Weston spoke of Corbin's bravery, his relentless humor under fire, and the unbreakable bond he shared with his 4-legged partner. Charlotte shared childhood stories, painting a picture of the deeply compassionate boy who grew up to be a warrior. The shared grief, once an unbearable, solitary burden for both of them, began to transform into a bridge of profound understanding and healing. At 9:30 a.m., Dr. Roland Pierce stepped into the ward, checking the monitors. "His vitals are incredibly strong," the veterinarian noted, looking at the charts. "The sedation is wearing off. He should be waking up any minute now." As if on cue, a low, groggy whine emanated from the cage. Charlotte and Weston instantly scrambled closer to the bars. Inside the enclosure, the massive Belgian Malinois shifted weakly. His eyelids fluttered, revealing deep, intelligent amber eyes. The dog let out a heavy sigh, his nose twitching as he took in the sterile smells of the clinic. "Hey, buddy," Weston whispered softly, leaning against the metal grate. "Easy now. You're safe. You're okay." The dog's ears swiveled toward Weston's familiar voice. He let out a soft, reassuring thud with his tail against the heated blankets, acknowledging his savior. But then the dog's nose twitched again. He took a deeper, more intentional sniff of the air, slowly, painfully. Despite the heavy bandages wrapped around his midsection, the dog lifted his scarred head. His amber eyes bypassed Weston entirely and locked onto Charlotte. Time seemed to stand still in the small room. Charlotte held her breath, tears instantly welling in her eyes. She slowly unlatched the heavy steel door of the cage and pulled it open, sliding her body halfway into the enclosure. She didn't speak. She simply extended her open hand, palm up, just as Corbin had taught her when they first began training dogs in their backyard, all those years ago. The Malinois stared at her, his nostrils flared, taking in her scent. The smell of the clinical antiseptics faded into the background, overridden by something ancient and deeply familiar. It was a scent tied to a sunny porch, woven paracord, and the comforting, echoing laughter of his original master. It was the scent of family. A remarkable transformation washed over the animal. The guarded, military stoicism melted away. The dog let out a high-pitched, emotional whimper that sounded heartbreakingly like a human sob. Ignoring the pain in his stitched side, the Malinois dragged his heavy body forward across the blankets. He didn't just sniff Charlotte's hand. He aggressively pushed his massive, scarred snout deep into her chest, burying his head against her scrubs. "Boo-hoo!" Charlotte collapsed forward, wrapping her arms completely around the dog's thick neck, burying her weeping face into his fur. "I know, Diesel," she cried, rocking the massive animal gently as he licked the salty tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know. You're home. You're finally home." Boo-hoo! Weston watched the reunion from the doorway of the cage, leaning his head back against the wall, his own chest heaving with silent, cleansing tears. The suffocating weight of survivor's guilt that had crushed his lungs for 3 long years finally evaporated into the morning air. He had done it. He had brought his brother's spirit home. Over the next 3 weeks, the Pacific Coast Veterinary Clinic witnessed a miraculous recovery. Diesel, no longer hidden behind the alias Blaze, proved his resilience once again. His incisions healed cleanly, his energy returned, and the light in his amber eyes burned brighter than it had in years. When the day finally came for his discharge, Charlotte walked out of the double sliding doors of the clinic, the morning sun warming her face. She held a heavy-duty tactical leash in her hand. At the end of that leash was a massive, proud Belgian Malinois, sporting a newly washed maroon and tan paracord collar with a hidden brass plate resting firmly against his neck. Waiting for them beside a dusty, battered pickup truck in the parking lot was Weston Ryder. He looked different, lighter. The haunted shadows banished from his eyes. Charlotte walked up to him, the dog immediately leaning against Weston's leg in greeting. She looked up at the rugged seal, a gentle, promising smile playing on her lips. "He's going to need a lot of long walks to rebuild his stamina," Charlotte said softly, her eyes holding his. "And I have a feeling he's going to miss his spotter. Are you staying in San Diego, Weston?" Weston reached down, scratching Diesel behind his missing ear tip before looking back up at Charlotte. The deep connection forged in the fires of their shared loss, sparked with the undeniable promise of a new beginning. "Yeah," Weston smiled, the expression reaching his eyes for the first time in years. "I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. If this incredible true story of loyalty, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond between a military working dog and his family touched your heart, hit the like button. Share this video with someone who'd want to honor our brave veterans and their canine companions, and subscribe to Beyond the Silence Tales for more miraculous reunions."
Hi, I'm Gwyneth Wynne, the owner and manager of Beyond the Silence Tales. The nurse found a seal sleeping beside his dying dog. Then she recognized the collar. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, the strongest feeling was compassion, and the quiet bond that can exist between people and the animals they love. Stories like this remind us to slow down, pay attention, and never overlook someone who may be carrying more than we realize. What moment stayed with you the longest, and why? Has a simple act of kindness ever changed the way you saw someone? If this story spoke to you, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy meaningful stories like this, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more from Beyond the Silence Tales.